Good day, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talks Thursday. I'm very happy to have Angela Vamola, head of Sub-Saharan Africa at GSMA, with me today. We would like to talk a bit about Africa and how policies, regulations can impact the mobile sector and the mobile operators, and how, at the end of the day, if we're not making sure the digital infrastructure is working well, we can't see the, let's say, so supposed digital growth in Africa. Hello, Angela.
Hello, thank you for having me here on your program today.
Thank you. Angela, few weeks ago, you launched a report, very interesting report about the role of mobile technology in driving the digital economy in Nigeria. So what is your experience, and what would you say are the key findings of the report?
Well, as in Africa, and Nigeria is not unique to the challenging macroeconomic situation that's affecting the citizens and governments in their ability to deliver services efficiently. The big headlines was, of course, Nigeria has been for a couple of years Africa's largest economy with a GDP of about $472 billion. But it is facing major headwinds in the future in terms of economic development, and it's slipping down in terms of its leadership as the largest economy currently, I think, to be around fourth in Africa. And simply because of the inflationary trend has really increased in the country, making businesses and small and large businesses really difficult to deliver on their agenda in the country. So, looking ahead, we try to understand the role that the telecom sector, can provide in enabling Nigeria and other like countries to overcome these challenges by leveraging what technology can do to increase productivity and decrease inefficiencies created over the years.
Thank you for that. So if we look not only at Nigeria, so from your experience, how are the current tax policies and, say, regulations impacting the growth and the sustainability of the mobile sector?
So when you look at in general, the mobile telecom sector continues to make significant progress across Africa. Year on year, it's about increasing the number of our citizens who are connected to mobile internet. And, Nigeria is not alone in terms of the growth that we've seen. On average in Africa, it's about 27% in sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe a bit, let's say, rounded off to 30% for the whole of Africa in terms of the number of people who are connected and using internet services. But the majority of the population continues to remain sort of offline in spite of investments made with 3G, 4G coverage signals available. For Nigeria specifically, the number was about 70% are still not using mobile internet. In Africa in general, it's about 60%. And so this is what we're trying to understand, to see what is the impact of taxes in creating a barrier for citizens to be able to use mobile internet. And one of the major barriers we see is in the area of the affordability of devices, as well as the affordability of data in terms of data services. And this is because we find that in Africa, the taxation of the sector continues both in terms of sector-specific taxes, as well as general taxes. Overall, the contribution tends to inhibit the cost of devices through, say, customs duties on devices, as well as excise duty and other duties, both general taxes and sector-specific taxes applied to the delivery of data. Because when you look at the cost structure of how services are delivered, a large component of the inputs in terms of the costs per megabyte or the costs of a voice service or an SMS service include a substantial amount of in terms of taxation. On average in Africa, you can go up to some countries as high as 70%, and some on average are, at about, say, 32%, 25% of taxes contributes to the cost structure. Over and above that, of course, then you have operational costs because services are delivered through infrastructure, which is very resource intensive and capital intensive. And so power, the availability of infrastructure such as energy, contribute a significant amount in terms of the cost structure. You'll find on average about 30 to 50% of the operational expenditure of telecom services are on energy. And so these costs will obviously tend to be passed down towards the cost structure of the cost of a megabyte or the cost of any service. So these tend to now make these services unaffordable for the majority of our population. And so we have to look at how we can enable the sector towards bringing more of our citizens online, so that at the end of the day, when we grow the economy through the amount of people and businesses contributing to the generation of revenue in the GDP, then the sector does not bear the brunt of carrying the economies. In Nigeria, in our report, we saw that 13.5% of the GDP in 2023 was contributed by the sector. That was an equivalent of about 33 billion naira, 33 trillion naira, of which the sector contributed about 2.4 trillion in taxes in that same year. But when we look at the projection and see what is the potential if we are able to add even 15 million customers who are using mobile internet into the economy, we see a 2.5% increase in GDP by 2030 if we're able to do that. But to do that, that is not a mean feat. It means that we'll have to relook at various policy and regulatory levers that can be employed that will encourage and promote these 15 million customers to become mobile internet users in the next 3-4 years.
If I can summarize, so we can break down affordability on one side from a regulatory perspective, infrastructural limitations, then we have tax policies. So what would you say are the reasons why the understanding of the opportunities behind having let's say, a well-working mobile technology sector, what stops them in tackling the issues?
So I think, for a long time, the telecom sector has been very successful in its ability to mobilize, cash. The sector in itself, generates contribution to the GDP, as we've mentioned, in terms of revenues, and is very efficient in its model, even through other services that have grown over the years, such as mobile money. And I think the ability of the sector to be able to carry other sectors in terms of the digital transformation agenda is the biggest opportunity that lies there for the region. So for a long time, governments, and Africa has a very large informal sector. So I think that ability for, being able to convert or formalize these economies has been a challenge for the region. But given that most countries now have very structured agendas on how digital transformation can unlock that potential, I think we need to start working very strategically and very clearly on what these levers ought to be that will encourage the formalization of these small, medium businesses that largely fuel our economies, and at the same time also encourage other sectors to embrace technology so that as they become more efficient and increase productivity, we will see a widening of the pie in terms of the contribution of other sectors to contribute to the economy. And I think that will sort of lessen the pressure that exists on governments to be able to mobilize resources very efficiently from the sector.
So would you say that probably a lot of countries seeing the mobile sector more as a revenue stream instead of having the deeper understanding or the maturity to understand how it can actually impact the economical growth of a country or society?
Most definitely. I mean, if you compare the telecom sector, say, with other sectors in Africa, you'll find sort of an inequality in terms of how governments sort of mobilize their revenues from the top line at the revenue level as opposed to earnings or profitability, because that allows the governments to appreciate that there is a cost structure towards delivering services, and it's not just about the top line revenue that you find that many operators, and very successful ones have in terms of their contributions to revenues. But if you look at the case, for example, of Nigeria, last year, both the big operators all declared losses to the tune of about 137 billion naira in Nigeria, simply because of the costs, and these are not unique to the telecom sector alone, because this is a macroeconomic situation. So the rising costs of fuel and other challenges in infrastructure costs, the naira in terms of the currency devaluation, all of these have obviously increased operations. And so one of the key advocacy or reforms that we were challenging governments to understand is, because operating costs have risen sharply, it's obviously a good opportunity now to actually review the cost structure of how services are delivered, because the costs, prices have not been reviewed for a very long time in that country. And so you find that they're operating below, costs in terms of delivering the same service to their customers. So these are just general principles and practices that, functioning markets really ought to embrace and practice. But, we have to see that because of the view that governments, collect their revenue from the top, an appreciation of the cost structures and the challenges behind that aren't seen, vis-a-vis looking at other sectors where taxation happens at earnings.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thanks for these insights. So during your roundtable, what was actually discussed, or can you share some of the, let's say, key findings or probably goals they have in mind?
Yes, so specific to Nigeria, there were 4 key challenges that impact the digital economy objectives for all policymakers and regulators, in terms of bringing more people into the economy. And so we wanted to look at it from the perspective of a model, an economic model that looks at how we would the delivery, if the sector was to increase the number of people who are using the internet by 15 million customers, what sort of enabling policy and regulatory environment would be required for us to achieve that? And what sort of impact would that have on the different sectors of the economy? And so 4 key challenges were discussed at that roundtable. The first one was about the security of telecoms infrastructure. And this is from and the second one was rights of way in terms of fiber networks, and given that we are moving towards emerging technology and the age of automation, how fiber networks have become critical towards the delivery of those services as well. And of course, we discussed the taxes on the mobile sector, as well as looking, as I've mentioned, how can we review the costs of delivering of services, given that the operating costs have risen sharply over the past few months in Nigeria. When you look at telecoms infrastructure security and rights of way of fiber, these generally are looking at how can we improve on lowering our operating costs, because Nigeria has a specific problem that's very prevalent in terms of vandalism of telecoms infrastructure security. Fibers that is always cut because of inefficiencies in terms of planning, how fiber is rolled out, and so we requested an appeal to governments to relook at categorizing telecoms infrastructure as critical because of the nature in its power and its contribution to the GDP, so that there's some sort of guidelines and guardrails that have been put into place that deter vandalism or just bad negligence, poor negligence, and management of infrastructure. You find that, for example, in Nigeria alone, in terms of fiber cuts annually, states, some of them had about 1,200 fiber cuts in a year. So that presents a huge challenge in terms of costs of fixing fiber, and at the same time, because we're looking at how we're going to digitalize other sectors, it means that for you to provide that sort of service level agreement with businesses and governments for services that you'd like to render to them, to be able to provide that service, you'd need to provide more than one fiber to that business, and that increases the costs of service delivery. So just looking at how you can just look at infrastructure in terms of its security and just categorizing it critical infrastructure was a discussion that we had. And rights of way generally just compounds the costs of compliance and administration, because when you look at a federal level, there is was a price set on the cost of fiber per linear meter, but when you look at it at a state's level, this is applied at their discretion, and so all these different costs that come in now begin to increase the cost of compliance. So there's no standard right-of-way approach across states, and not all the states have adopted the introduction of a zero-rated or lower rights-of-way fees that were recommended at a federal level. Again, you have very lengthy administrative processes just to deliver the service to businesses and government. So these were the areas that we discussed and said, if we can have some policy reforms and regulation that allows users and players who are trying to deliver services and request for those services, if they can be simplified, this will reduce the costs. And as we know, for you to be able to attract foreign direct investment into the region, we need to make sure that the unpredictability environment in terms of administrative processes, tax policies, and how they're consistently or inconsistently applied really creates that sort of environment that allows us to attract or detract the sectors from foreign investors.
Sounds like a bumpy road ahead if we look at all these areas.
Yeah. Well, I think if you try to just put them in buckets and have specific asks for each of these areas, you don't ask for too much, but just try to structure so that policymakers and regulators are able to really look at what they can do, because I think that is the win at the end of the day, how we can partner together with government so that we can deliver together on the developmental agenda in the fastest way possible.
Yeah, it's always interesting. I mean, I have this conversation since the last few years already, and it's mostly the same outcome when we talk about infrastructure. But it's also interesting now to dig deeper into the topic of affordability. I mean, we hear a lot of buzzwords like we have the gender gap, affordability, digital literacy. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the strong foundation, which should be provided by the government from an infrastructure perspective, also from a policy harmonization perspective, if we don't achieve that, I personally don't see that something will change. Probably in 5 years, we have the same conversation. What is your feeling in a role with your work within GSMA? I mean, you talk to the operators, you talk to the governments. Are you optimistic? Do you think there is a movement? You do a lot of educational stuff as well with your reports. We read them, we write about them. It's always very valuable. So what is your, let's say, summary in terms of outlook?
I think, well, as they say, if you keep on doing things the same way, you shouldn't expect a different result. So what we did differently this year in terms of this particular report and how we have engaged with the government of Nigeria and stakeholders, including those in the telecom sector and other organizations such as the World Bank, who are also keen on trying to make a difference. I think our ability to sit together around a table, unpack what this means, begin to understand how the policymakers in government, whether it's the regulator or the minister of the sector or other adjacent sectors, as we mentioned, energy sector, to begin to understand what they can do and really quantify the impact, in able to present a case that can be discussed, within the cabinet, to understand how those goals for the sector marry into the developmental goals and whether working together will deliver that agenda faster. I think this is what needs to happen for us to be able to foster that environment that allows us to move forward and not go round and round in terms, as you said, having the same view year on year and not seeing anything different. Because if we're not able to look at the burdensome policies or regulations that hinder the industry's growth, as we've mentioned, the sector being an enabler of other sectors, then that means that we'll continue to stifle the growth of the economy as well as innovation in general. So I believe that we had a good discussion with the government and stakeholders in Nigeria, and I think you can look out for impactful outcomes in the near future, not far, as promised by the government, that they are really taking a serious look at some of the suggestions that we offered on the table.
All right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a very interesting point that we have to deal with it in buckets, so we can't have a solution one fits all. So that definitely will not work. But what would you say is the biggest challenges of those you already mentioned? Is it more from an investment perspective that we need to keep these countries must be attractive? So, because if you have not a functional infrastructure, it will be difficult to get investments. Or is it more the political will and the maturity of the governments?
Well, at the end of the day, the private sector has to function and will continue to function. The model is around your ability to deliver on the promise of your service proposition. And so because the telecom sector is a capital intensive sector, it relies heavily in their investors to see the opportunity and the realization of value from the investments that they make into the sector. Therefore, our ability to be able to de-risk the sector and provide sort of a view of how we're dealing with these problems will continue to give confidence to investors that the sector is still viable. The challenges can be overcome; they are surmountable, and together, with willing partners and an ability to work together and articulate those challenges in a way that allows governments to see the opportunity, will enable us to continue investing in the sector. Because if we stop where we are, which is largely majority in Africa on 4G, the digital divide will continue to widen, because we need 5G to be able to start delivering on the promise of emerging technologies. AI, blockchain are very promising in terms of how they can help Africa leapfrog in some of our very fundamental and structural problems in other sectors such as health and education. And so if we see the opportunity that the enabling the sector will allow Africa to move faster, then we are able to now work very well in how we can attract that foreign direct investment into the sector. And I think it's a win-win for everyone at the end of the day.
Thank you. You mentioned just a quick point. You talked about AI quickly. So I had a quite interesting conversations at the GITEX in Marrakesh, where a lot of technology companies said, yeah, look, AI is very interesting, but we need the infrastructure for it, because it's a high processing power is needed. I mean, it's these cloud solutions. So we come back to the same story. Without a working infrastructure, without governments paying attention to this and maintenance, as you also outlined in your report, it will be difficult.
Yes, and that's true. So it's vital for the long-term growth of the sector in Africa. in delivering and continuing to invest for emerging technologies, so that now with those clear, consistent, transparent policies and regulations, the government can help us create that more conducive environment for investment, for innovation, and competition in the industry.
Yeah, just my last question out of curiosity. When you have this conversation with the governments, do you feel that there's an understanding of, okay, look, if we manage that well, we can even increase the current revenue stream. We just have to, let's say, make some adjustments here and there, make it easier for them. At the end of the day, we will grow. Is that really given, this understanding? Is the maturity there? Or you still feel there is still kind of an educational process necessary?
I believe capacity building and strengthening there'll always be a need for that throughout. We can't expect all governments to be at the same level. Some are more ahead than others in the maturity to understand the impact that such policies have to increase the digitalization of other sectors. For example, in Nigeria, we were able to show how when looking at agriculture or manufacturing, transport and trade, the biggest opportunity from our report is in agriculture, where if we increase digitalization of the agricultural sector, we will be able to add up to 3.3 trillion naira, which is about an equivalent of 2.8% to the GDP, and 1.1 million employment to the sector. So I believe if you're able to go deeper and build capacity in understanding how the sector in itself delivers value and its cost structure towards empowering users directly to engage with the mobile internet, because that's where the value of digitalization comes. How does a farmer use the internet to be able to increase their productivity in the agricultural sector or in the manufacturing sector, whether it is transport or trade? But that maturity level is not at par across all governments. And therefore, we see our role also within the GSMA to provide that capacity building and have that conversation so that they are able to see the opportunity, able to break it down, and then have now very sound discussions with the players in the sector on what do we need to do now to create those policies that are clear and consistent that will attract that investment.
So it will be an ongoing process for sure.
For sure, it doesn't end, and this is not something that will happen tomorrow. But I think when you look at lighthouse countries who are already keen to really understand that we see the challenges they have manifested today, now we can sit on a round table and discuss what do we need to do to unlock this potential that seems to be stuck.
Yeah, just as my closing statement and also partly a question. So what I really liked about the report was that there was kind of a realistic view on the challenges, but not only challenges, also outline what could be the opportunities for these markets. So you talked about Nigeria. So what can we expect next from GSM Africa in terms of educating governments and showing them where the opportunity lies?
So we would like to, there are two key things that we're trying to work on that really improve the operating costs of the sector given the macroeconomics that are at play. Number one is the green energy transition. So I think the sector is a leading sector globally in terms of how we're approaching our contribution to climate action. And so given that we need energy and power to fuel our sites for the delivery of our services, we're working on a green energy transition and a multi-sectoral approach. So we'll be talking about that and revealing what we have been working on this year at MWC Kigali in October, where at the ministerial program we'll have a session on towards a green energy transition future for the sector. Additionally, we're also looking at how we can work together with like-minded organizations such as the World Bank and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to be able to build capacity for fiscal policymakers on how to understand how the sector works and unpacking that structure so that we can be able to tackle together the challenge on taxation which has, creates a burden on the costs and the affordability of the services to our people. So again, we'll be talking about that at the ministerial program at MWC Kigali. And I welcome everybody, all your listeners, to be with us in Kigali between the 29th and the 31st of October, where we'll be talking about these issues and how we can all work together for this purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Angela. It was a pleasure. And I'm sure we're going to see each other in Kigali, that's for sure. That was Tech Africa News with Tech Talk Thursday. You can find more on techafricanews.com.